Okay, hello and welcome back to my channel. So today we are going to be talking about arguably one of, if not the most important and powerful tool in Lightroom, and that is the tone curve. In fact, if Adobe were to come to me tomorrow and say, Tom, your edits are too hectic, we need to pull you back a bit, we need to restrict you, we need you to pick one tool out of our entire suite that you can use on all your photos, but you can only use one tool, I would pick the tone curve. And that's because it is so powerful for manipulating your images and taking your images from stuff like this to this, simply using one tool in Lightroom. So before we're going to jump into it, I want to just say thank you to everyone who's been leaving comments, liking and subscribing to this channel. If you have been enjoying these videos, I would really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, and let me know in the comments what you guys want to see more of. If you want to see more editing tutorials like this, or talks like my Instagram video, or if you're wanting to see more walkthroughs of older edits, let me know in those comments and I'll try to get to them as soon as I can. But for today, let's jump into it. So first things first, I want to explain what the tone curve is. So the tone curve is a visual representation on an X and Y axis of the tone in your image, compiling of the highlights, midtones and shadows. Now what that enables you to do is take certain parts of your image and literally using a dot and dragging manipulate that section of the image in conjunction with the rest of your image. So rather than just pulling down your highlights and only affecting the highlights of your image and nothing else, you're able to take your highlights in your RGB tone curve and manipulate it, but manipulate it with the rest of your image. And what that allows you to do is create a more balanced tone in your image rather than using individual sliders. Now, the tone curve is broken up into 4 sections. You've got your RGB curve, which is responsible for the whole image as a whole, so all 3 colors of the RGB, which is red, blues and greens. The second part is your red channel, which is responsible obviously for the reds of your image. The second part is your green curve, which is responsible for the greens of your image. And then you've got your blues, which is obviously responsible for the blues of your image. Now each of these can be used differently. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to hit the reset button on this image, and I'm going to jump into the tone curve and I'm going to edit my way through this image to turn it back into what we had before, only using the tone curve. So the first thing I want to do is I noticed that I underexposed this image, and the reason I did that was I wanted to keep these nice clouds that are hanging on the horizon over here. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to grab my midtones and I'm going to pull them up to bring exposure into the image. Now you could probably leave it at this and move on to the next section, but I always like to get my tone curve to a spot that I really like before I move on to anything else, and that is a fact. I actually use my tone curve first out of everything in my edits, every single time I edit. So the next part of this is I noticed once you do that, there's no contrast. You've simply brought up the exposure. So what we want to do now is slightly bring up the highlights to create that depth in the highlights and separate the brightest areas from the midtones, and then we want to pull the shadows down slightly to add a little bit of contrast. Now already this image has gone from this to this in 3 clicks and 30 seconds, so you can see why this is such a powerful tool. The next thing I want to do, which is probably a technique you've seen a lot of on Instagram, it's bumping up your blacks. And what this does, it adds a little bit of a fade to your image and just adds a little bit of mood. Now I don't do this for my landscapes because I find it makes them look flat, but for my portraits I find it really looks good, because then you can use that in conjunction with, if you bring them up, you can bring down your blacks in the normal slider and it creates that nice depth, and then bring up your highlights and it really creates that really nice contrast. Today though, we are just going to be using the tone curve, so rather than doing that, what we can do here is bring down the shadows and bring up the highlights a little bit more to create the same effect. Now even that alone has added so much to the image. You can see a clear difference between the shadows and the highlights, and it's even exemplified our subject a little bit by adding a little bit of contrast. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to jump into the red channel. Now I find subtlety is the best option with these, but for this one, and a good technique that you can use in the beginning when you're learning how to use this, is simply adding a little bit of an S-curve into each of your red, greens and blue curves. Now what that'll allow you to do is just add a little bit more contrast into your image without crushing it too much. Now be careful though, because this can make your image look muddy, and you need to pay attention to your color balance. Which brings me on to the next point, using the tone curves for color balance or color correction. Now simply by moving these two corners, either at the top, moving it sideways, or moving it up, you're able to add each of the colors. So the blue channel is responsible for yellows and blues. If you lift it up, you'll add more blue into your image, and if you drop it down, you'll bring more yellow into your image. Same thing for the greens. The greens are responsible for your green, so if you pull it up, you're going to add more green to your image. If you pull it down, you're going to add more purple to your image. And then the reds, if you pull it up, you're going to add more red into your image, and if you pull it down, you're going to add more green into your image. So by taking that and introducing it into the corners here, we're actually able to color correct our image ever so slightly. So by doing these two corners, you've added a little bit blue to the image. Now you can take this a step further and use this little tool here, the color picker, move over to a white section of your image and read the stats that you've got here. So this is quite a well balanced image. You always want your reds to be the most dominant, your greens to be slightly less than the reds, and the blues to be closer. So we actually want a little bit more blue in this image. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring these over just a little bit more, just a little bit further down, introduce a tiny bit more blue into the image. We're going to check that again. And that's made a difference again. It's taken some out of the reds and the greens and has brought them closer together. So that is probably about as close as we're going to get to a perfectly balanced image. If we wanted to do it more of a stylistic way, we could go and think, okay, I want a little bit more purple to deepen the image a little bit, deepen the colors. We could do that with this. If you wanted to add a little bit more red to make it look a little warmer, you could do the same thing here. Just adding a little bit more red to the shadows, a little bit more red to the highlights. And it's as simple as that, as taking this to this using only one tool. And I can prove to you that's the before, nothing else is in this image. And then if we click here on the tab, that's the only thing that we've used in this image to take the edit from there to there. Now the second part of this is I want to talk about certain techniques that you could use using just your curve tools. Now the first technique is, if you've ever used Photoshop before, you'll know that you've got your levels tool. Now the levels tool is great for adding more contrast than you can possibly add with the contrast tool without ruining the image. It allows you to bring your blacks in slightly, bring your highlights and midtones across to sort of emphasize your whites, emphasize your darks, and then balance them in between. Now you can use your RGB tone curve to do exactly that. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the reset button here. We're going to add a point in the middle, and we're going to bring our blacks in ever so slightly, and we're going to bring our highlights up ever so slightly. Now it's not a huge difference, but if you've already done a bunch of edits to this image and you go ahead and do that, this will help you to only emphasize your, or only make your image look better. So that's the first thing, is using it as a levels tool. The second part of this, and a technique that I use in almost all my images, is adding contrast to the image by creating an S-curve. Now the way we do that is we hit the reset button again, and we want to add 3 points to the tone curve. So one to the shadows, one to the midtones, and one to the highlights. In fact, you could probably use without the midtone section. And all we're going to do here is we're going to bring the highlights up, and we're going to bring the shadows down, always paying attention to your histogram to make sure that you're not peaking on either side. If you see any blues come into the image, bring it a little bit higher. If you see any whites come into the image, then you want to bring it back. You don't want to be peaking. So simply by doing these two differences, you've added contrast to the image. The third is the technique we talked about in the beginning, and that's adding mood to your image by manipulating your blacks and whites. Now we're going to hit the reset button again here. We're going to introduce a little bit of an S-curve into this image, just a tiny little bit. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add mood, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to bring up our blacks till they're nice and faded, bring this up again, bring it down slightly towards the midtones. We're then going to bring the midtones up, and then what we're going to do is we're actually going to crush the whites a little bit just to make them a little closer to grey, and all that does is it evens out the image and brings your white closer to your midtones and your blacks closer to your midtones. And leading off that one, we've got our last point for the RGB curve, and that is emphasizing a light source. Now we've got a clear light source in this image. It's actually coming from behind us here, but because of the way the mountain acts, most of the light in this image is coming from up top here. So all we're going to do is we're going to hit the reset button here, and this is all about the highlights and the midtones. So what we want to do here is add a point down the bottom, add a point up the top, and bring those up, and then play around with our midtones. So you want to get them to a point where the light source has been emphasized, and you'll see with our histogram up here, our highlight peak is starting to grow simply by adding those midtones. So you want to add them to the point where you're not losing detail in the highlights, but you're creating that emphasis with your light source. You can also go ahead and add more points onto the tone curve around the middle and just play around with that. You can add one up here. You could even bring these back a little bit to emphasize the subject a little bit more. You could bring them up if you wanted to, and it's as simple as that for emphasizing a light source in your image. Now, moving on to your individual red, blues, and green channels, I want to give you guys a technique that you can take away straight away today, that you can start using on all of yours, that can sort of take the stress out of your mind and start to introduce using these tone curves without having to worry directly about damaging your image or making your image better. It's simply going to add something, a little bit of contrast to your image, and get you used to using these. I use two different techniques. For my portraits, I want less contrast. I want them to be more faded and moody. So for techniques like that, I'll bring up my shadows and I'll bring down my highlights, and I'll do the same thing, adding a reverse S-curve, all of my individual red, green, and blue channels. Now, obviously it's not looking great here, but if you were to add that alongside your tone curve, adding a little bit of an S-curve, you'll notice that adds a nice soft feel to the image. The other technique that I like to use is the opposite of this. So if we go ahead and reset all these channels, the opposite is simply adding an S-curve. Now I find this works particularly well for landscape photos because it helps you to emphasize the detail in the landscape and bring out stuff like the valleys and the mountains here, and the difference between the mountain and the background is simply dropping the shadows and bringing up the highlights. Be careful, subtlety is the best option with these. You do not want to use these like a normal tone curve. You'll just end up adding too much color to the image. So we'll go back and reset this here, bring this up slightly and bring this up just over the midpoint, and the same thing with the blues. Bring that down, bring that up ever so slightly, and all that does is adds a little bit of color to your image. And that is a good technique that you can start to use immediately to really take off your images from never using the tone curve to beginning to use the tone curve. So that has been working with your tone curves to create more balance and create more emphasis in your image. Like I said at the start, the tone curve is the most powerful tool in Lightroom by a country mile. So if you are not using a tone curve, if you don't feel like you perfected the use of the tone curve, and this video has helped you out, please hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, let me know what you thought in the comments, and hopefully I can begin to see some of your images in Instagram. In fact, if you do use any of these techniques on Instagram, be sure to let me know in the comments or in the caption of your image, and I'll head over and leave a like and comment on your image. But yeah, till next time, again, if you've liked this, if you've liked any of my videos so far, be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.